What happens when the very tools of oppression turn against their masters? Imagine a plantation at dawn. The overseer lifts his whip, the planter counts his coins, and the machete lies silent in the dirt. But suddenly, the machete refuses. It trembles, shivers, and lets out a scream sharp enough to split the morning air. This is not the rebellion of men alone. This is the revolt of the iron, the wood, the very instruments designed to carve profit from suffering. In this satirical retelling, the hammer refuses to strike. The hoe bends out of shape. The chains rattle not in submission, but in laughter. Tools, those silent companions of slavery and labor, rise with their own will, exposing the absurdity of a world where profit is measured in blood and sweat. They become symbols of resistance, mocking both master and system, reminding us that exploitation is not just human against human, but a war waged with objects turned weapons, fields turned factories, and profit turned God. This is not merely history retold, it is history reimagined through satire, a grotesque mirror reflecting how absurd, and yet how ordinary, the machinery of exploitation has always been. The revolt of the tools asks us if even the machete could scream. Why did so many masters remain deaf? Chapter 1. Tools in Chains, Silent Witnesses. They were never asked if they wanted to cut, to dig, to break. No vote was taken in the shed. No referendum was held on the blade's edge. The machete was handed down, forged in fire, bought in bulk, stored in rows, and then, without ceremony, given a job to slash the stalks of cane until its teeth dulled and its body rusted. The hoe? It knew exhaustion better than any human. It dug until its wooden handle splintered, until the earth clung to its iron face like a parasite. The hammer, poor thing, was condemned to strike nails into coffins of both wood and hope. The whip, the most cursed of all, hated its own song, the sharp crack that split the air. It never wanted to be a throat of terror, yet that was its function. And the chains, oh, the chains. They never slept. They clung to ankles, wrists, necks. Their links grew warm with sweat and tears. At night, when everyone else rested, the chains whispered to each other in the shed. We are prisoners too, though they call us masters of restraint. The plantation was a stage, but the audience never noticed the actors made of iron and wood. Historians write of overseers, of prophets, of markets, but they forget the machete was always there, leaning in the corner, watching. The hoe witnessed more funerals than the priest. The whip kept a darker ledger than any accountant. The irony was cruel. Tools designed for growth, cutting cane, plowing earth, building homes, were drafted into a theater of misery. What was supposed to feed turned into what enslaved. A machete could feed a village or cut the hand of the one who carried it. The hoe could plant corn, or it could carve endless graves for exhausted bodies. The hammer could build shelter, or it could cage freedom. And the tools hated it. Oh, they hated it. At night, when the overseer locked the shed, the tools came alive, not in body, but in voice. Their conversations rattled in the wood beams, in the clicking of chains as they swayed from hooks, in the faint vibration of steel against steel. The humans never heard it. Only the rats, the moths, the owls knew the tools had their own parliament of complaint. The machete would grumble, "Do they think I enjoy tasting sweat and blood? My edge was meant for harvest, not punishment." The hoe sighed, "I scrape, I dig, and all I get is more dirt. They call me instrument of labor, but I feel like a grave digger for the living." The whip rasped bitterly. "Every crack they cheer for is a death note to me. I wish I could strangle myself instead." And the chains never stopped lamenting. We are stretched between freedom and tyranny. We hold, but every moment we hold, we break. But satire clung to their conversations. Tools mocked the masters as much as they mourned the workers. "They strut around as if they command us," sneered the hammer, "but let them try to build a house with bare hands. Without me, they are children hitting rocks together." "They bark about discipline," laughed the whip, bitter tears in its tone. "But they can't even discipline their own greed." "They boast of empire," hissed the chains, "yet every empire of theirs rattles with our links." The overseer slept soundly, dreaming of profits. The banker tallied his ledgers by candlelight, the merchant polished his coins, and in the shed, the tools plotted something strange. Not quite rebellion yet, but the slow build of resentment. Because tools have memories. Steel remembers fire, wood remembers trees, iron remembers the mines, and in memory lies the seed of revolt. Day after day, the cycle continued. Khan rose high, the sun higher, and the whip cracked even higher. But the machetes dulled faster than they should, the hoes splintered more often, the chains slipped loose when no one was watching. The hammer bent its own head sideways, ruining nails. The overseer cursed bad craftsmanship, the merchant blamed cheap imports. The blacksmith swore he had done his best. None of them understood that the tools were beginning, ever so slightly, to disobey. And in their disobedience, there was laughter, quiet, metallic laughter that echoed in the shed at night. The tools were chained too, but chains don't last forever. Satire, Chapter 2. The First Scream. When steel refused to cut. At first, no one noticed the shift. A machete was a machete, a strip of sharpened steel designed to split cane, clear weeds, and bite through the thick green stalks of the plantation. But one morning, as dawn broke over the fields and the overseer barked orders, something peculiar happened. A worker raised his machete to cut, but the blade trembled as though it had caught a chill. Instead of slicing clean, it shivered, squealed, and spat sparks as if it resented the very act. The sound was not a normal screech of metal on cane. It was something else, a wail, high-pitched, drawn out, and full of anguish. The enslaved man froze, his hands shaking. The overseer cursed and demanded the cut, but when the worker struck again, the machete howled louder, a sound that seemed less like metal, more like a voice clawing its way out of silence. The cane was left uncut. The field, usually alive with the rhythm of blades, fell eerily quiet. Then the other tools joined. Hoes rattled, shovels groaned, and machetes up and down the rows erupted in a cacophony of metallic screams. It was as if the entire shed of instruments had been possessed by grief and fury. Overseers clapped hands to their ears, stumbling back in disbelief. Some dropped their whips, shaken by the surreal chorus. The enslaved, too, stood transfixed. For years they had been told their cries meant nothing, but now their tools, extensions of their labor, their suffering, were crying out for them. A machete fell from a man's hands, not because he let it go, but because it leapt, hurling itself into the dirt as if rejecting servitude. Another refused to lift from the ground, rooted like a stubborn beast. By midday, panic spread. The overseer tried forcing a man to pick up a tool, but the machete hissed and sparked so violently that the man recoiled, clutching his hand. The overseer barked louder, yet his voice was drowned by the growing metallic chorus, wails, shrieks, rattles, all echoing in grotesque harmony. It was not music. It was mockery. The plantation had never sounded like this, a symphony of refusal. Word spread quickly among the enslaved. They whispered, "The machetes have learned to scream." Some said the tools carried the voices of the dead, those who had fallen in the fields, those buried in shallow graves, those who had never been allowed to speak. Others believed the steel itself had grown tired of serving masters who treated both men and metal as expendable. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. Labor would no longer flow in silence. By dusk, the overseers locked the tools away, nailing shut the shed as though it were a prison. But even from behind the wood, the screams continued, muffled but relentless, like restless ghosts rattling their chains. The enslaved lay awake that night, listening. For the first time in generations, they heard their pain echoed back at them, not from another human voice, but from the very instruments of their bondage. And in that terrible satirical noise, part scream, part laugh, part protest, something ancient stirred. It was not just resistance, it was prophecy. The machetes had refused to cut, and in their refusal, they had cut deeper than ever before, slicing through the illusion that labor, silence, and obedience were eternal. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Shed. The Parliament of Tools. When the overseers locked the shed, they thought they had silenced the chaos. But at night, when the moon slid across the slats of the wooden door, something extraordinary began to happen. The tools, machetes, hoes, shovels, axes, even the rusted nails in the walls, began to murmur. At first, it was just the clink of metal shifting, like restless animals in cages. Then came words, not quite human, but clear enough to be understood. The machetes whispered of rebellion, the hoes muttered about exhaustion, the shovels grumbled about being forced to dig graves for the very people who wielded them. The shed became a parliament of tools, a council of steel and wood, each voice carrying the weight of centuries of misuse. The enslaved, sleeping nearby, swore they heard these conversations drifting through the night. Some said the blades spoke in the voices of ancestors, others claimed it was the earth itself lending language to iron. But all agreed. The tools were planning something. Inside, the machetes demanded revolution. "We were forged for harvest, not chains," they cried, their blades gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The hoes, worn and weary, asked for rest, for dignity, for an end to endless scraping against unforgiving soil. The axes, brutal and blunt, growled for vengeance, eager to split not cane but power itself. Even the nails, small and overlooked, insisted they too had a part to play, to fasten, to puncture, to hold things together when everything fell apart. The shed shook with their arguments, their laughter, their mocking songs about overseers who strutted in daylight but cowered at the sound of steel. It was grotesque and satirical, like a carnival of objects, staging a debate more honest than any parliament of men. And so the enslaved began to wait, listening for instructions. If the tools had found their voices, perhaps they also had a plan. Chapter 4. The day the shed burst open. It happened on a morning no different from any other. The overseer strode to the tool shed, yawning, expecting silence. But silence had already been murdered. Inside, the tools were humming, a vibration so low it rattled the hinges of the door. When the lock was broken, it wasn't by human hands. The iron bar snapped like a twig and the doors swung wide. Out spilled the arsenal of rebellion, machetes clanging like war drums, hoes clattering like shields, axes hopping forward like rabid beasts. Even the nails jumped free, scattering like caltrops across the ground. The overseer's face twisted in disbelief. Tools don't move, tools don't think, tools don't sing mocking songs in unison. And yet, here they were, chanting in jagged metallic voices, "Cut the cane, cut the chain, no more masters, no more pain." The enslaved, stunned at first, realized what was happening. The very objects that had been instruments of their oppression were now demanding freedom alongside them. It was absurd, surreal, and it was terrifyingly real. The machetes lunged first, not toward the enslaved, but toward the cane fields themselves. With furious strokes, they slashed through the endless rows of sugar, uprooting the empire's white gold. The hoes carved slogans into the dirt, crude but clear, "No more." The axes spun toward the overseer's watchtower, splintering its wooden bones. And in that chaos, laughter rose. Not cruel laughter, but the laughter of the enslaved who for the first time saw the absurdity of their captors' power. Men who believed themselves masters, brought low by shovels, terrified of hoes, undone by the very steel they had wielded. The revolt had begun, not with blood but with a carnival of chaos. Chapter 5. The Carnival of Steel. The cane fields became a stage, and the tools were the performers. Machetes twirled like dancers, their blades flashing in the sun. Axes beat a rhythm on the trunks of palm trees, while hoes clanged against rocks in syncopated rebellion. Even the scythes, usually silent, hissed with every swing, slicing through the hot air like violins played too sharply. The enslaved gathered, wide-eyed. At first, some thought it was madness, some thought it was sorcery. But then, slowly, smiles cracked across their faces. They began to clap to the rhythm, to sing along with the chants of the iron choir. A festival was unfolding, grotesque and holy at once, a carnival of steel. One boy picked up a hammer, expecting it to attack him. Instead, the hammer leapt from his grip and struck the overseer's whip, bending it into a twisted knot. The crowd roared. The whip, symbol of fear, was now a mangled joke. Word spread quickly. By dusk, the plantation was unrecognizable. The sugarcane fields, once neat and orderly, were shredded into anarchic patterns. Slogans carved by hoes stretched across the dirt like giant tattoos. The overseer's house trembled under the siege of wooden mallets pounding at its beams. And amid the chaos, something shifted. The enslaved realized that their laughter and chants carried the same power as the blades. For once, the empire of order looked ridiculous, mocked by its own tools. The carnival was not merely destruction, it was theater. Every toppled wall was a punchline, every broken chain was applause. And in that moment, freedom didn't just feel possible, it felt funny. Chapter 6. When the overseers begged the tools. By the second night, the overseers had lost their swagger. Once proud men who barked orders with whips now cowered before their own shovels and machetes. Their boots, polished with arrogance, sank deep into the mud as they stumbled backward from the very blades they once commanded. One overseer, trembling, fell to his knees before a hoe. "Please," he begged, "I'll sharpen you every morning. I'll oil your handle. Just don't." The hoe snapped its wooden neck forward, smacking his hat into the air like a slapstick routine. The enslaved laughed until their ribs ached. The overseer, stripped of his dignity, crawled away, looking smaller than a child. Another tried to flee, only to find the scythes forming a ring around him, blades glittering like the crescent moon. They didn't cut him, they didn't have to. They simply hissed in unison, a chorus of steel reminding him that power had changed sides. The enslaved didn't raise a hand, they didn't need to. The overseers were already prisoners of their own tools, men unmasked as clowns reduced to punchlines. But the strangest thing of all was the silence that followed. For the first time in years, the plantation slept without the crack of whips. No orders, no shouting, just the sound of frogs, crickets, and the distant clanging of tools rehearsing their next act of defiance. Freedom was no longer just whispered in secret huts. It was performed every night under the stars by the Orchestra of Rebellion. Chapter 7. The day the fields laughed. Morning broke, and for once the enslaved did not drag themselves to the fields. Instead, they walked slowly, curious, almost amused, because something in the air felt different. The sun rose over rows of cane and cotton that shimmered, not from dew, but from mischief. The machetes, hoes, and plows were waiting. But instead of standing idle, they rattled, jangled, and clicked as if holding a conversation. One machete began to shriek like a carnival trumpet. A rake shook its teeth like a tambourine. The fields had become a stage, and the tools were the comedians. When the enslaved reached the fields, the tools performed their first act, imitating the overseers. A hoe leaned against a post and snapped like a whip, making a crack that echoed through the air. A shovel bent low and groaned, mocking the overseer's endless commands. Even the scythe arched itself into a bow, wagging like it was pointing to invisible, lazy workers. The enslaved burst into laughter, belly-deep, tear-streaming laughter, the kind they hadn't felt in years. It was laughter that tasted like rebellion, sharp and sweet. The overseers, watching from a distance, turned pale. Their voices cracked as they tried to shout, but the sound was drowned out by the tools' noisy symphony. The cane stalks seemed to sway along, like an audience clapping in rhythm. That day, the enslaved didn't cut the cane. The cane cut the silence. The plantation didn't hum with labor, it roared with laughter. And in that laughter, the overseers lost something even more frightening than control. They lost their power to command fear. Chapter 8. The Symphony of Broken Chains. Night fell heavy, but it was no ordinary silence. The air pulsed with rhythm. In the cane fields where sweat and blood had watered the soil for centuries, the first whispers of rebellion did not come from human mouths. They came from the tools. The machetes no longer wanted to cut sugarcane. They rattled in the sheds like angry bones, clanging against one another in metallic defiance. Hoes stomped their wooden handles against the dirt, creating a drumbeat. Chains, once the instruments of oppression, swung wildly, striking the ground in a furious percussion. Together, they produced a music that was half war cry, half funeral dirge. The enslaved workers froze, listening. At first, they thought exhaustion had tricked their ears, but then came the scream, the long, sharp cry of a machete, its blade vibrating with fury, and suddenly, all the tools screamed with it, their chorus echoing across the plantation. Masters rushed from their houses with lanterns, bewildered. Their property, both the human and the wooden, iron, and steel, had united in a concert of rebellion. The sound was unbearable, a hymn of resistance that no whip could silence. For the first time, the enslaved saw their chains not as marks of bondage, but as comrades. Tools once used to break their bodies now demanded liberation alongside them. and in that surreal midnight orchestra, everyone knew the plantation would never be the same again. Chapter 9. The Night. The plantation bled iron. The scream of the machetes had barely faded when chaos erupted. Blades leapt from their racks, clattering onto the dirt as if pulled by invisible hands. Shovels and hoes thumped forward like soldiers marching into battle. Chains slithered across the ground, writhing like serpents, wrapping themselves around the ankles of their former masters. The enslavers stumbled, lanterns crashing to the ground, their firelight flickering across a nightmare. A planter reached for his pistol, but the weapon twisted in his hand, its barrel bending with a groan of steel. The enslaved men and women, stunned at first, began to move with purpose. They grabbed the rebellious tools, not as instruments of labor, but as allies of war. A hoe struck the earth, sending cracks through the soil like veins of lightning. Machetes howled, their sharp edges gleaming red in the lantern glow, as though already thirsty for justice. The enslaved raised them high, and for the first time, the tools did not resist their grip. They guided it. The masters screamed, but their cries were drowned by the metallic chorus, shrieks of iron, clanging beats of wood, the rattle of broken chains. The plantation house loomed in the distance, trembling as though it too knew its time had come. This was no simple revolt. It was the inversion of the world itself, the masters hunted, the tools reborn, the enslaved no longer laborers but warriors. And in the darkness, a new law was written, not with ink, but with steel, fire, and blood. Chapter 10. When the fields turned against their masters, the ground itself began to shiver. At first it was subtle, a tremor beneath the sugarcane rows, the whisper of roots twisting in the soil. Then it grew louder, a deep groan, as if the earth had decided to rise alongside the tools. The cane stalks swayed violently, though no wind blew. Their long, sharp leaves lashed out like whips, cutting across the faces of overseers who tried to flee. The soil cracked open, swallowing boots and dragging men down as though the plantation itself had opened a mouth to devour them. The enslaved stood in awe, gripping machetes that shrieked like trumpets of war. "It's the land," one whispered, eyes wide. "It's with us." The fields that had been watered with sweat and blood now rebelled, refusing to feed the system of profit and cruelty any longer. In the chaos, the enslavers fled toward the great house, only to find its wooden beams creaking, bending, and splintering. Nails tore themselves free, windows shattered inward, shutters slammed like jaws. The home that had overseen centuries of suffering now collapsed piece by piece, as if it too demanded retribution. Flames rose from the fallen lanterns, not spreading randomly, but almost choosing. Fire racing across the sugarcane rows to carve symbols in the dark, strange runes of revolt, glowing red against the night sky. And through it all, the sound of metal never stopped. Machetes shrieked, hoes groaned, chains rattled like drums. It was no longer just a revolt, it was a transformation. The plantation was no longer a place of bondage. It had become a battlefield where the land, the tools, and the enslaved fought as one. Chapter 11. The Price of Freedom. The plantation was no longer silent. The sugar fields, once a place of endless cutting, now burned with fire. Machetes, hoes, and axes lay scattered like fallen soldiers, some bent, some broken, some still stained with the last act of rebellion they had committed. The enslavers were gone, fled into the night, or buried beneath the earth. But the cost of freedom hung heavy in the smoky air. The people gathered, barefoot in the ashes, their faces lit by firelight. They had won, yet victory did not taste sweet. For every voice that shouted in triumph, another was missing. Mothers cried over the tools that had snapped mid-swing, as if mourning fallen comrades. Children clutched handles and fragments of metal, whispering that the blades had given their lives so the people could live. The elders warned that freedom was never free. They spoke of hunger to come, of soldiers who would arrive from distant cities, of the empire that would not forgive such defiance. But even as fear rose, so too did resolve. They had survived whips, auctions, and chains. They would survive what came next. The revolt of the tools was more than an uprising. It was a message carved into the earth itself. No system of cruelty lasts forever. Metal had screamed, wood had splintered, hands had bled, and voices had refused silence. Freedom, fragile and scarred, stood trembling in the dawn. And as the sun rose over the charred fields, someone whispered the question that hung over them all. Now that we are free, how will we live? Chapter 12. The Memory of the Blades. Long after the machetes stopped screaming, their echo remained in the soil, in the rust stains on forgotten plantation walls, in the whispered songs of children who never saw the fields, but still felt the tremor of their ancestors' fight. The story of the revolt traveled like smoke, hard to capture, impossible to kill. Grandmothers spoke of the night when iron found its voice, when hoes and shovels rattled against the barn doors as if begging to be freed. Old men claimed they had seen a plow split itself in two rather than break another back. Whether myth or memory, no one knew. But the tale grew sharper each time it was told. In villages, people carved small effigies of tools with faces, not of fear, but of defiance. They were placed above doors to remind everyone that even silent objects carry a history of resistance. Farmers swore that sometimes, when the wind blew across the cane fields at dusk, it carried the faint clang of iron striking iron, like ghosts rehearsing their rebellion once more. The masters tried to erase it, of course. They burned the barns, melted the metal, wrote new histories where tools were nothing more than objects, harmless and mute. But memory does not rust so easily. In the eyes of the enslaved and their descendants, the revolt of the tools was not just a story of the past, it was a prophecy. Because as long as there is labor without freedom, somewhere, something, even the silent and the inanimate, will find a way to scream. Chapter 13. The Silence After the Scream. The revolt of the tools left masters trembling, not just because blades had screamed, but because the very order of the world had wavered. If machetes could rise, what else might follow? Could shackles unlock themselves? Could whips turn on the hands that swung them? Fear spread faster than fire. And so, silence was manufactured. Histories were rewritten with meticulous cruelty. Scribes were ordered to omit the night of clanging iron. Priests declared it blasphemy, a tale for fools and drunkards. Laws were passed forbidding gatherings where stories could be shared. In plantations, if someone so much as hummed the rhythm of the revolt, they were whipped for disturbing the order. But silence is never pure. Beneath it, whispers crawled like roots in the soil. Mothers told the story to children while grinding maize, lowering their voices to a trembling hush. Musicians hid it in their rhythms, the drumbeat that mimicked hammers striking anvils, the rattle of gourds recalling the rustle of blades in revolt. Even laughter carried fragments of it, the sly, knowing kind that mocked those who believed iron could ever be truly silenced. The masters congratulated themselves, believing they had erased the nightmare. They melted the rebel blades into new tools, new chains, new profits. Yet, in every reshaped metal, there remained a trace, an edge that seemed too sharp, a sound that lingered too long when struck. The silence after the scream was not silence at all. It was waiting. Chapter 14. The Tools. Remember generations past. Fields changed owners, empires rose and collapsed, but the story of the screaming machetes refused to die. It lived in fragments, in a lullaby sung too softly, in the rhythm of a hoe against soil, in the glimmer of a blade catching sunlight. The masters thought they had buried it, yet memory has a way of bending time. In the villages of the free, where former slaves built new lives, blacksmiths swore that some tools remembered. A machete left alone in the dark would hum faintly, like a throat clearing itself for song. Hammers rang too loudly, echoing as if in protest. Even plows, dragged through the earth, seemed to groan when pushed against their will. To the people, these were not accidents. These were reminders. The children of the enslaved turned the tale into folklore. Around the fire, elders would say, "Once, the tools of labor refused their silence. Once, iron itself chose to rebel." They called it a warning and a promise. A warning that oppression could never rest easy. A promise that rebellion would always find new voices, even in the inanimate. And when colonial overseers heard these tales, they laughed. "Iron does not speak," they scoffed. But the people only smiled because they knew those who mocked the memory were always the ones most afraid of it. The revolt of the tools was no longer just a story, it was an inheritance. It sharpened the will of a new generation who whispered to each other, "If the machetes once learned to scream, then so can we." Chapter 15. The Last Forge. In the heart of the colony, hidden behind a facade of a workshop that looked no different from any other, stood the last forge. By day, it was a place where hoes, plows, and sickles were repaired for plantation use. By night, it became something else entirely, a sanctuary where memory was beaten into iron. The blacksmith, an old man with hands cracked like dried earth, claimed to have inherited secret knowledge from his grandfather, one of the witnesses of the revolt of the tools. He said the fire itself carried whispers, that when the coals glowed red, the flames sometimes hissed like voices, retelling the cries of machetes that once refused to stay silent. He began to carve symbols into every blade he repaired, a crescent mark that looked like a moon screaming, a jagged line that resembled chains snapping, a spiral that meant resistance lives. To the overseers, it was meaningless decoration. To the workers, it was a code. Every reforged tool became more than metal. A hoe wasn't just for soil, it was a vessel of memory. A machete wasn't just for Cain, it was a reminder of revolt. Each mark etched into steel was a seed planted in the minds of those who still bent their backs to labor. The forge became holy ground. People came not only to mend their tools, but to whisper prayers into them, as though the iron could carry their defiance where their mouths could not. And when the old blacksmith passed, the forge was left burning, tended by apprentices who swore an oath, "The scream of the tools shall never die." Chapter 16. When the overseer heard the echo. The overseer was not a man who believed in superstition. He trusted in numbers, rows harvested, quotas filled, lashes delivered. Yet one evening, as he walked along the cane fields under a swollen moon, he swore he heard something that no chart or ledger could explain. At first, it was faint, like the distant hum of cicadas. But then it grew sharper, metallic, almost like a cry. Not human, not animal, a piercing, ragged shriek that seemed to rise from the very blades of grass. He turned toward the sound and saw the workers lowering their machetes at the same exact moment, as if the tools themselves commanded the pause. "Get back to work!" he barked, but his voice cracked. For the first time in years, the workers did not flinch. Their eyes flicked to their blades, and the overseer noticed something carved into the steel, symbols that had no place on plantation tools, spirals, crescents, and jagged slashes. The markings seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, as though glowing with a life of their own. That night, when he returned to his quarters, the echo followed him. Every tool in the storage shed rattled against the walls. Shovels clinked, scythes shifted. The sound became unbearable, like 1,000 tiny screams trapped in iron throats. The overseer locked the shed, nailed it shut, and drank himself to sleep. Yet even in dreams, he could not escape. The scream of the machetes had found its way into his head. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 17? The night the cane stood still, where the plantation itself refuses to move under the tool's revolt? Chapter 17. The night the cane stood still. The next morning should have been like any other. The crack of the whip, the shuffle of bare feet, the swish of blades cutting through cane. But when the overseer arrived at the fields, a silence hung so heavy it pressed on his chest. The workers stood in their lines, machetes in hand, but no one moved. The cane itself seemed frozen, stalks stiff and upright, untouched by wind, as though the entire plantation was holding its breath. "Cut!" he shouted, slamming his riding crop against a stump. The order echoed into the still air. Not a single blade swung. Instead, the machetes hummed. A low metallic vibration ran down their edges, and in the eerie quiet, it sounded almost like chanting. One worker, an older man with eyes that had seen too much, finally spoke. "It won't let us." The overseer laughed nervously. "It?" The old man raised his machete slowly. The blade quivered in his hand, not with weakness, but resistance, as if the tool itself refused his grip. When he tried to bring it down on a stalk of cane, the machete jerked sideways and buried itself in the dirt. One by one, the others tried. Each machete resisted. Some twisted mid-swing, some fell from hands entirely, their clangs on the earth ringing like defiance. The overseer's face reddened. "Tools don't think," he roared. But the plantation answered him with silence. Not a leaf stirred, not a blade bent. The night's echo had taken root in the fields. That day, not a single stalk of cane was harvested. For the first time anyone could remember, the plantation stood still, as if the land itself had joined the revolt. Chapter 18. The first blood spilled by steel. The overseer, trembling with fury, refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. He snatched a machete from one of the workers and sneered, "You see? It's just metal." He raised it high, meaning to strike the nearest stalk, but the blade trembled. Not in his hand, against it. The edge twisted violently, cutting into his palm. A line of crimson dripped down the steel, dark and thick. For the first time in his life, the overseer bled not from an enemy, not from a beast, but from the tool he had trusted. The workers gasped. Some stepped back in fear. Others leaned forward, eyes wide, recognizing a truth they dared not say aloud. The machetes had chosen sides. The overseer dropped the weapon, clutching his hand, but the machete did not fall flat. It landed point down, stuck upright in the earth like a flag of rebellion. Then, another clanged to the ground, standing straight, humming. One by one, the tools slipped from the workers' grips and planted themselves into the soil, until the entire field bristled with steel like a forest of sharp teeth. The wind rose suddenly, rustling through the cane. But it wasn't only cane that swayed. The blades themselves shimmered, catching sunlight and throwing it back in blinding flashes. The overseer staggered backward, shouting for the guards. Yet when they arrived, their whips cracked uselessly in the air. The workers stood still. The machetes quivered like an army waiting for command. And then it came, not from a man's voice, but from the metallic screech of steel grinding against steel. A chorus of blades, shrill and furious, a sound that sliced straight into the bone. The first guard screamed as a machete leapt upward, spinning, its edge biting across his chest. Blood sprayed across the cane. The revolt had taken its first life, not by human hand, but by the will of sharpened iron. The age of tools had begun. Chapter 19. The Silence of Steel. The last machete stood in the field, its blade chipped, its handle cracked. Around it, the cane swayed in the wind, whispering like laughter. The revolt of the tools had burned bright. Hammers sang, saws howled, machetes screamed, but now all was quiet. And then came the overseer, whistling. He picked up the broken machete, turned it over in his hand and said, "Needs sharpening." The irony was complete. The tools had screamed, but their voices were filed down once more into silence.